You know how people talk about that one moment that changed their life? Like the time they met their spouse, or got the job, or finally figured out that the S on Superman's chest just stands for hope? Mine? It was when a bright, aggressive shade of orange invaded my perfectly adequate, slightly beige Thursday morning. I was on the porch, see, enjoying a genuinely good cup of coffee, the cheap stuff, but I nailed the ratio, and contemplating the profound mysteries of scrolling through my feed. Life was simple. Life was peaceful. Then the mail came. The second I saw that envelope, I knew. It wasn't the friendly 20% off dry cleaning orange. This was the nuclear alarm. We are going to ruin your day, orange. It was an official notice from the City of Pleasantville Department of Code Enforcement. I'm Gary Jenkins, by the way. Just your average guy whose greatest life ambition is to never, ever be bothered. Which, in a place like Pleasantville, USA, is basically an act of war. I ripped the thing open. The headline, in a font that screamed, "We mean business," read, "Official Notice of Violation. Failure to maintain acceptable vegetative health." I actually snorted coffee out my nose. My lawn. They were fining me for my lawn. Let me paint you a picture, because you probably have some Hollywood version of a lawn in your head. Mine wasn't a pristine emerald carpet. It wasn't a golf course. But dead? That's just slander. I'd call it drought-tolerant. Or maybe perpetually autumnal. It was certainly more brown than a forgotten banana peel. And yes, when you walked across it, it was crunchy enough to sound like a bowl of Rice Krispies being violently attacked. But it was stable. It wasn't hurting anyone. Except, apparently, the fragile sensibilities of my neighbors. Specifically, Mrs. Henderson. I swear, that woman has a telescope pointed at my front yard 24/7. Her lawn, naturally, is a freak of nature. A luminous, chemically dependent green monster that probably requires a small, dedicated water tower and an army of tiny gardeners. I hadn't even finished the first paragraph of the violation notice when her screen door slid open with that telltale, smug shing noise. "Good morning, Gary," she trilled, her voice dripping with the fake sweetness of cheap maple syrup. She was already out there, pruning a rose bush that probably hadn't even been planted yet, just to show off her commitment to vegetative health. I folded the paper, trying to keep my face neutral. "Morning, Carol. Lovely morning for micromanaging nature, isn't it?" She ignored the sarcasm like a professional. "Just making sure the neighborhood stays up to standard, dear. You know how important curb appeal is for property values." "Oh, I'm fully aware of property values, Carol. I assume you received a copy of this official notice?" I rattled the orange paper. She paused, gave a thin, lizard-like smile, and snipped a perfect bloom. "I can't imagine what you're referring to, Gary. But if it pertains to unsightly conditions, I'm sure the city has every right to enforce the rules." "Right. The rules," I mumbled, flipping the paper open again. They were fining me $300. $300 for some crispy blades of grass. That's a new coffee machine. That's a weekend getaway. That's 30 nice dinners. And the kicker? The deadline to rectify the situation was 10 days, followed by accumulating daily fines. This wasn't about the lawn. This was about power. This was about Carol Henderson and the faceless bureaucratic monster she served, telling me how I was allowed to exist in my own space. I looked at the $300 figure, then at my brown, innocent front yard, and finally at the impeccably manicured, smirking perfection of Mrs. Henderson's rose bush. A thought, slow and wicked, began to simmer. "You know, Carol," I said, looking right at her, a genuinely nasty smile forming. "I think you just gave me an excellent idea on how to rectify this situation permanently." She blinked, confused. "Good. Let the woman of perfect beige be confused. This was no longer about grass. This was a vendetta. I was going to fix this problem, and when I was done, my solution was going to be so absurdly compliant with the letter of the law that it would make her precious HOA rulebook spontaneously combust. My life was officially ruined, and it was all because of a $300 fine. Game on, Pleasantville. $300. 10 days. That's what the city of Pleasantville, through its chief agent of suburban chaos, Mrs. Henderson, had given me to turn my crunchy brown acreage into a velvety green beacon of compliance. My first thought, the sensible one, which lasted about 45 seconds, was to fix it. Just give them what they want. It's grass. How hard can it be? Apparently impossibly hard. I immediately embarked on a series of hilarious, low-effort attempts, which I shall now detail, mostly so you can share in my subsequent legal and financial trauma. Gary's half-hearted lawn-saving initiative, aka the desperation list. The flooding technique, days 1 to 3. I figured water was the key. Simple. I left the sprinkler on for 3 days straight, turning my front yard into a swamp that quickly ran down the street, leading to a neighbor complaining about a minor lawn-induced flash flood. The grass remained stubbornly brown, but I did grow a truly impressive colony of sidewalk moss. Result: failure. The super-duper miracle grow gambit, days 4 to 6. I bought the cheapest, most aggressively named fertilizer I could find. Something that promised immediate, terrifying growth. I dumped the entire bag out, mostly in the spots where the lawn looked most dead. This resulted in 0 grass growth, but a stunning, toxic-looking yellow fungus sprouting up in irregular patches. It looked less like a healthy lawn and more like a warning sign from the CDC. Result: epic fail. The green spray paint cover-up, day 7. This was my masterstroke, my stroke of genius, my incredibly cheap, desperate, and ultimately stupid idea. I bought 5 cans of cheap, exterior-grade, matte green spray paint. I figured if it looks green from 30 feet away, who's going to complain? I spent a sweaty afternoon painting the brown patches. The effect was immediate and disturbing. Instead of a natural lawn, it looked like I had laid down a massive, low-budget football field that had already started to peel. When the sun hit it, it shimmered with the unnatural sheen of plastic army men's, the blame-shifting technique. Day 8. I spent a day looking up weather patterns and blaming climate change. I didn't actually do anything, but mentally I felt like I was solving the problem. Result: high mental comfort, 0 physical change. By day 9, my yard looked less like a lawn and more like the site of a chemical spill covered up by a toddler with a can of Krylon. And then the inevitable happened. The mail truck pulled up again, and this time the envelope wasn't just orange. It was red-striped, certified, and felt menacingly thick. The new fine was for $600. Not $300, $600. The title was the ultimate insult: Notice of Continued Violation and Unauthorized Coloring of Public-Facing Vegetation. Unauthorized coloring. They knew. They knew I had spray-painted the grass, and you can bet your bottom dollar who reported it. I stormed out onto the porch, waving the notice like a lunatic, just as Mrs. Henderson was hosing down her already damp front walk. She looked up, feigning innocence. "Oh dear, Gary, another issue?" she asked, tilting her head. "This," I hissed, waving the $600 fine. "This is harassment, Carol. It's a $600 fine because I tried to make the grass green with a product I bought at a store." "Well, you see, dear," she said, her smile widening into a triumphant, terrifying expression. "The rulebook is quite specific. Section 8, subsection C. All attempts at vegetative remediation must involve organic, growth-stimulating processes. Artificial chemical coloring agents are strictly forbidden. It's all about maintaining the integrity of the green space. You understand?" I understood, all right. I understood that this woman and the bureaucratic machine she worshipped didn't care about grass. They cared about control. They cared about adherence. They were using the word lawn as a weapon. That's when the switch flipped. The moment of pure, spiteful, suburban enlightenment hit me as I stood there, staring at my patchy, painted, dead but now artificially dying lawn. I was angry, yes, but mostly I was determined. I was not going to pay this fine, and I was not going to plant another blade of grass. If they fine me for having a dead lawn, I thought, the realization ringing in my ears like a cash register, I'll just make sure I don't have a lawn at all. The solution was obvious, immediate, and wonderfully abrasive. I would pave the entire thing. All of it. Turn that messy, high-maintenance patch of dirt into a smooth, impervious, zero-maintenance slab of glorious concrete. But wait. If I just paved it, they'd hit me with a fine for improper use of impervious surface or failure to maintain required ground-level water runoff mitigation. I knew their game. I had to pave it and designate it as something untouchable. Something that required a permit so complex, a fine against it would require an act of Congress. A helipad. The idea was a hazy, half-formed spark of spiteful brilliance, but it required confirmation. I needed to know if paving, under the guise of something else, was the key. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the City Planning and Zoning Department. I put on my best, confused, slightly timid homeowner voice. The phone rang for an eternity before it was answered by a woman who sounded like she hated her job more than I hated my lawn. "Zoning?" she clipped. "Brenda speaking." "Hi, Brenda. My name is Gary Jenkins, and I have a quick question about ground cover requirements." "Ground cover is regulated by the HOA in most zones, sir. Please contact your neighborhood association first." "Yes, I know, Brenda. But this is a specific structural question. I'm thinking of doing some large-scale landscaping. I was wondering what the process is for laying down a significant amount of material like, say, concrete, in the front yard." Brenda sighed, a long, dramatic sound that must have used up half her daily oxygen supply. "That would be an impervious surface change, sir. You'd need an IS-47 form, runoff calculations approved by a certified engineer, a detailed blueprint showing drainage, and you'd have to specify the purpose of the surface. We have strict rules on lot coverage." "The purpose, you say? What kind of purposes are generally approved for a permanent, large, concrete surface?" I asked, leaning in, already feeling the bureaucratic adrenaline. "Parking expansions, approved shed foundations, sometimes recreational courts, depending on the setbacks. Why, what were you planning on putting in?" I took a deep breath. Time to test the waters. "Well, I was actually looking at something regulatory. You know, something governed by higher-level rules. Like a specific kind of landing area. Something for, say, a quick turnaround, Non-commercial, vertical takeoff and landing use. Silence. Just the dead air and the faint, tinny sound of Brenda typing. "Sir," she finally said, her voice now edged with suspicion. "Are you asking about a helipad?" "I'm just asking about the required permits, Brenda. If one were to, hypothetically, need permits for something like that, would the zoning rules override the impervious surface rules, since the structure would be designated for an approved transportation purpose?" She launched into a 5-minute-long, incomprehensible monologue about overlapping municipal, state, and federal regulations. The gist was, if it was a properly permitted, officially designated structure, it played by its own rules, and the common impervious surface rules might be superseded. The devil was in the details, and the details were buried under a mountain of paperwork she seemed reluctant to provide. "Look," I interrupted finally, "I just need to know if the rules are different for a transportation surface than they are for, say, a really big patio." "Yes, sir, they are vastly different. You would need to consult the FAA guidelines, which we do not provide." Perfect. She didn't know the answer, which meant neither did the city. It was a bureaucratic blind spot. I thanked Brenda, hung up, and stared out at my $600 worth of unauthorized coloring. A slow, satisfied grin spread across my face. They wanted me to maintain the integrity of my green space? Fine. I would give them integrity. Industrial grade, high traffic, FAA-regulated integrity. They wanted me to be compliant? I would be so compliant it would break their system. "Carol," I muttered to the empty air, "you just woke up a sleeping giant, and this giant prefers paving over pruning." The new mission was clear: pave the entire yard green and get it zoning approved as a helipad. This wasn't landscaping. This was war. The moment the helipad idea took root, the bureaucratic fear vanished, replaced by a kind of wild, manic joy. I had the what, but now I needed the how. Specifically, I needed a contractor who was competent enough to pour concrete correctly, but confused enough not to call the police on me. I decided to interview 3 different paving outfits. This whole process was a study in suburban madness, with me playing the role of the mildly eccentric millionaire with very specific tastes. First up was Solid Foundations Paving, run by a gentleman named Mitch. Mitch was old school. He arrived in a clean, professional truck and spoke in measured, gravelly tones, the kind of guy who judges you based on your grout lines. "So, Mr. Jenkins," Mitch said, surveying my shamefully spray-painted brown patch, "you're looking to tear out the sod and replace it with a driveway extension?" "No, Mitch," I said, leading him to the center of the yard. "I want to tear out the sod and replace the entire front yard with concrete from the sidewalk to the porch, fence to fence." Mitch's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. "The whole yard. That's a lot of impervious surface, sir. You'll have drainage issues. We usually recommend a paver stone system for high aesthetic value and water mitigation." He was already launching into a sales pitch for fancy interlocking bricks. "Mitch, let me stop you right there. I don't care about paver stones. I don't care about high aesthetic value. I care about a perfectly flat, perfectly durable, industrial-grade concrete slab. Think airport runway, but smaller." "An airport runway?" Mitch shifted uncomfortably. "For what exactly? Parking an RV?" "No, I need it for transportation purposes, specifically vertical takeoff and landing." Mitch blinked once, twice. He looked around the quiet street, then back at me. "Sir, are you planning on landing a helicopter here? Because that requires specific..." "It requires specific permits, Mitch, which I'm working on. Your job is just the concrete. High PSI, smooth finish, and here's the kicker. It needs to be dyed or coated in a specific dark shade of green. Mitch looked at the spray-painted grass, and then at the clean concrete on my existing driveway. Green? Why green, Mr. Jenkins? Let's call it Vegas green. It needs to be uniform, vibrant, and, well, green. If it was natural grass, it would be the greenest grass in the county. Since it's not grass, it needs to be the greenest concrete in the county. Mitch shook his head, tucked his clipboard under his arm, and gave me a quote that was roughly the price of a small European car. He was clearly trying to price himself out of my madness. I appreciate your time, Mitch. I'll be in touch, I said, knowing full well I wouldn't. The traditionalist was too scared of the concept of the job. Next was quick and dirty concrete solutions. The guy, who introduced himself as Fast Frankie, was clearly running an operation out of a dilapidated shed. He smelled vaguely of gasoline and desperation. He took one look at the yard, grinned, and pulled a crumpled cigarette out of his pocket. A whole yard, huh? You want to get rid of the grass? Smart. Grass is for suckers. I need high-grade concrete, Frankie, dyed green, and I need it done fast and absolutely perfectly flat. Green, huh? I got some glow-in-the-dark stuff. Great for driveways. We can mix anything into the pour, boss. What's the purpose? Want to make a giant pool table? It's going to be a landing surface, for air traffic. Frankie paused, lighting his cigarette. Air traffic? Like drones? Bigger than drones, Frankie. Think heavy payload, quick drop-off. He winked. Say no more, boss. Say no more. Look, I can do this job for you. Real cheap. No permits, no questions asked. I come in on a Saturday morning, tear it up, pour it, and we're done by Sunday. Cash only. No paper trail. We'll call it a super patio. This was tempting. God, was it tempting. But the entire point of this exercise was to achieve a legal, zoning-approved victory. Going off the books would just lead to a fine the size of Texas when Carol Henderson inevitably called the code enforcement guys. The sketchy guy was a shortcut to a worse disaster. Thanks, Frankie, but I need official permits and documentation. Gotta keep it strictly to one. On the up and up, I said, feeling like a hypocrite while planning a fake helipad. Frankie just shrugged. Your funeral, boss. But that paperwork will cost you more than my concrete. He wasn't wrong, but this was about more than cost. This was about principle. Then there was Tony, from Tony's heavy-duty paving and landscaping. Tony was built like a cinder block and wore a perpetually tired expression, suggesting he had seen every possible way a suburbanite could mess up their yard. He didn't speak much. He simply walked the perimeter of my yard twice, pulling a small laser level out of his pocket, checking the slope. He was efficient, focused, and didn't make small talk. Concrete the whole thing, I explained, standing next to the spray-painted mess. High strength, flat as a billiard table. I need it graded right, obviously, for drainage, but I don't want any decorative cuts. Just one big, beautiful slab. He grunted. Gonna be expensive. Lots of tear out. Where you gonna put the topsoil? Take it, sell it, I don't care. I need every molecule of grass and dirt gone. All right. What's with the green? Tony finally asked, pointing at the patchy paint. I need the concrete to be that color, or a shade darker. I call it Vegas green. It's a requirement. Tony squinted at the color. Epoxy coat, probably. Dyeing concrete that strong a color is messy. We'd have to use an industrial-grade, tinted resin top coat. Expensive, very durable. That what you want? Yes, very durable. And it needs to be ready for heavy, intermittent traffic. Tony finally looked me directly in the eye, his expression unreadable. Look, Jenkins, I've poured pads for commercial dumpsters. I've poured basketball courts. I've poured retaining walls that could hold back the ocean. If you want a perfectly flat dark green slab, I can do it. But you gotta tell me, what are you landing on this thing? A hot tub? I sighed, realizing Tony was the one. He was practical. He just wanted to know the engineering requirements. Tony, I'll be honest with you. It's for a non-commercial vertical takeoff and landing pad. Tony just stood there for a beat, processing. He didn't laugh. He didn't gasp. He didn't even call me crazy. He just tilted his head and asked, "What's the maximum landing weight? Gotta spec the rebar correctly." I nearly kissed him. Let's assume a light utility helicopter, say 3,000 pounds, just to be safe. 3,000 pounds. Got it. Tony scribbled something on his pad. And the green, you serious about that? It's gonna look like a giant, shiny, low-budget golf green. You know that, right? Tony, that is the exact aesthetic I am going for. I want people to look at it and wonder if I'm eccentric or a genius. And if they ask, I'm both. Tony actually cracked a tiny smile, the corners of his mouth twitching upwards. Fine. You pay the bills, I pour the slab. You handle the FAA paperwork, I handle the concrete. We good? We are golden, Tony. When can you start? He looked at his calendar. Tear-out starts next Tuesday. We'll be done with the pour by Friday. I immediately signed the quote. It was pricey, but Tony's practical madness was worth every penny. Tuesday morning arrived like a military invasion. The moment the claw of the mini excavator tore into the spray-painted soil, I knew there was no going back. The noise was indeed louder than a rocket launch. Use exclamations! The sight of Tony and his crew efficiently scraping away every last vestige of the grass and brown dirt was immensely satisfying. Mrs. Henderson, of course, was immediately pressed against her front window, periodically slipping out to pretend to check her mail, while actually staring daggers at the industrial destruction of my yard. The chaos list. Noise. The relentless thwump crash of the demolition was so loud, I had to take my work calls standing in the garage with a pillow pressed to my ear. Dust. The neighborhood was coated in a fine, powdery haze of dead grass and concrete dust for 2 days. I saw Carol Henderson wearing a medical-grade mask while watering her roses. Victory 1000. The rebar. The intricate grid of steel rebar they laid down made my yard look like a maximum security prison for gophers. It was serious infrastructure. I loved it. The concrete truck. When the enormous concrete truck rumbled down my quiet, leafy street, it looked like a prehistoric beast had come to feed. The chute swung out over the foundation pit, and the gray sludge began to flow. But the real magic happened on Friday. The pour was complete, leveled perfectly, and ready for the finish. That's when the Vegas green epoxy arrived. It wasn't paint. It was a thick, viscous, industrial resin that Tony's team started spreading across the massive gray slab. As the sun hit the newly applied epoxy, it cured into a stunning, uniform, deep emerald color. It was almost offensively green. It didn't look like grass. It didn't look like nature. It looked exactly like what it was. A man-made, unkillable, perfectly flat, high-strength monument to spite. It was loud. I stepped back, coffee in hand, gazing at my masterpiece. It was a giant, glossy green welcome mat for a helicopter that didn't exist. There was an immense, simple joy in this spiteful victory. The joy of zero maintenance, legally compliant, aggressively green, anti-lawn. The neighbors were silent. Mrs. Henderson's blinds remained tightly shut, the ultimate sign of defeat. The next step, the real challenge, was convincing the city that this slab of aggressively green concrete was, in fact, a necessity for public air travel, not just a bizarre landscaping choice. The paperwork war was about to begin. This is the final push. To complete the full 10,000-word story while strictly adhering to the remaining section. Word counts: 1,750 plus 1,500 plus 2,000 plus 1,500 sounds equal 6,750 words. I will structure the remaining content into the required parts. The Vegas green slab of spite was beautiful, but it was just concrete until the city blessed it. My initial call to Brenda in zoning had been an important scouting mission. I knew the weak point. The rules for a dedicated transportation surface were murky and complicated, falling into the overlapping jurisdiction between municipal code, state transportation authority, and the dreaded FAA. This meant nobody in my local zoning office actually knew the rules. They just had a stack of forms. And where there is complexity and a stack of forms, there is a loophole wide enough to land a small Cessna. I spent the next 2 days, while Tony's concrete cured to an impenetrable hardness, immersing myself in the world's most exciting literature, municipal code. I bypassed the tedious, impervious surface sections and went straight to the obscure stuff. Chapter 14, Part B, Section 22. Regulations concerning private auxiliary transport structures. Buried in the jargon, I found the gem. The code required a permit for any structure designed for non-vehicular ingress and egress. It didn't mention size, frequency of use, or actual possession of the aircraft. It only required that if a structure met certain safety and marking criteria to avoid, accidental landings in someone's rosebush, the city had to grant a provisional permit for public safety purposes. They couldn't say no, because that would be like saying they didn't care about the safety of low-flying aircraft. I marched into the zoning office on a Monday morning, carrying a folder stuffed with papers I had printed off the FAA's website, mostly useless but intimidating, and a carefully filled out IS-47 form designated as a Private, Non-Commercial Vertical Takeoff and Landing, VTOL, pad. I approached the counter, and who was there? Brenda, still sounding like the joy had been vacuumed out of her soul. Zoning. Do you have an appointment? No, Brenda, but I have my completed IS-47 form here for my approved transportation structure. I slid the form across the counter. Brenda picked it up, her expression immediately souring as she read the purpose field. Mr. Jenkins, this form is for impervious surface changes. You're building a shed foundation or a driveway extension, correct? Incorrect, Brenda. If you look at the purpose field, I'm designating the surface as a VTOL pad. It falls under Chapter 14, Part B, Section 22, and requires a provisional safety permit. I pointed to the relevant line, which I had highlighted in aggressive yellow. She frowned. VTOL pad? Sir, you need to file an application for a variance if you're building a structure that is not in compliance with standard residential zoning. Ah, but this is a compliant structure, Brenda, because it's a necessary safety measure regulated by federal guidelines. The city's own code states that where federal transportation safety regulations apply, they supersede local surface rules for the designated area. The surface is required to be impervious and properly marked for safety. I delivered this mouthful of bureaucratic nonsense with the confidence of a seasoned lobbyist. Brenda stared at the form, clearly looking for a checkbox that said, "Reject crazy helipad guy." There wasn't one. The system was designed to handle a deck or a fence, not interagency regulatory warfare. She finally called her supervisor, a woman named Sharon who wore a beige cardigan and the look of someone perpetually contemplating retirement. Sharon listened to Brenda's exasperated whisper, looked at my green yard on Google Maps, which I knew she checked, and then looked at me. "Mr. Jenkins," Sharon said, peering over her reading glasses. "We don't process helipad applications here." "I'm not asking you to process the application for the airspace, Sharon," I replied smoothly. "I am asking you to process the permit for the ground surface required to meet the city's mandate for safety marking in areas potentially affected by low-altitude transport. If I don't mark the surface, I could be held liable for an accident. I am trying to be a responsible citizen." "But where is your helicopter, sir?" she asked, echoing Brenda's previous confusion. "It's on back order, Sharon. Supply chain issues, you know. I'm simply preparing the required infrastructure to meet the anticipated future need. You can't issue an occupancy permit until the smoke detector is installed, right? This is the same principle, but for a turbine engine." Sharon looked defeated. She consulted a thick, dusty binder. She looked at Chapter 14, Part B, Section 22. She looked at my highlighted IS-47. She looked at Brenda, who just shrugged helplessly. "The form is technically filled out correctly," Sharon muttered, massaging her temples. "And he did cite the relevant code section regarding safety marking requirements." She eventually signed the form, marking it "Provisional Approval Pending Safety Markings and Inspections." She warned me that any actual landing required FAA clearance, which was definitely not her department. "Understood, Sharon. Just the markings for now. Public safety first," I said, collecting my stamped paperwork. I walked out of that office, clutching the provisional permit, feeling like I had just robbed Fort Knox using only a dictionary and a high-powered photocopier. I had won the paperwork war. Now for the high-visibility finish. The next day, Tony was back with his crew, not for concrete, but for paint. We weren't talking about sidewalk chalk. We were talking about industrial, high-visibility, traffic-grade paint. The kind of paint that screams, "Look at me, I am important air infrastructure." I watched with pure glee as they used enormous stencils and measuring tapes to apply the final touches to the Vegas green slab, a massive, bright yellow, internationally recognized circle, and smack in the center, a huge, perfect H. The finished product was jaw-dropping. My front yard, formerly a crunchy brown patch, was now a glossy, emerald green, 2,000 square foot piece of legalized defiance, ready for business. It was absurd. It was beautiful. The immediate neighborhood reaction was a mix of shock, admiration, and terrified confusion. The first major confrontation, the moment I knew I had officially broken the suburban mold, came an hour after Tony packed up the stencils. A patrol car, slow and suspicious, drove past my house, stopped, reversed, and pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a young, serious-looking police officer, badge gleaming, radiating the weary confusion of someone whose training did not cover residential helipads. "Sir, I'm Officer Ramirez. I received a call about unauthorized ground markings." I walked out onto the helipad, calm as could be, with my provisional permit folder tucked securely under my arm. "Afternoon, officer. I can assure you these markings are fully authorized. You can step right here. The epoxy is cured." Officer Ramirez looked at the giant yellow H under his feet, then back at my perfectly normal two-story American home. "Sir, this is a residential street. You can't just paint a giant H on your front yard." "Actually, officer, according to Section 4B, subsection 2 of the Municipal Code, which governs safety markings for provisional transport infrastructure, I have a fully approved VTOL pad." I pulled out the stamped IS-47 form, laminated and ready for its close-up. Ramirez squinted at the paper, his mouth slightly agape as he read the title. Provisional approval for V2OL pad surface markings. He looked from the paper to the house, then back to the paper. But you can't land a helicopter here, sir. That violates air traffic rules and noise ordinances. I agree completely, officer. And I won't. I'm not using it. I'm simply complying with the safety mandates required to have the structure designated as a VTOL pad. The markings are for public safety in the event of an emergency low-altitude maneuver, which, as a responsible citizen, I have prepared for. Ramirez spent a full 5 minutes on his radio, clearly talking to his dispatcher, who was likely talking to the zoning office. The conversation was audible. Yes, a green concrete helipad. He has paperwork. Yes, the zoning office. No, he does not have a helicopter, just the letter H. Finally, the officer hung up, defeated. He tucked his notepad away. The city confirms the ground markings are provisionally approved, Mr. Jenkins, he said, his voice flat with official reluctance. I am issuing a warning, however, regarding any violation of municipal noise ordinances should this pad be used for its stated purpose. Understood, officer. Loud noises are not my thing. Have a peaceful afternoon. Ramirez drove away, leaving a perfect black skid mark on the pavement. I had used bureaucracy to defeat bureaucracy, and the police couldn't stop it. The story was simply too good to stay local. A picture of the H somehow made it onto a community Facebook group. Within 2 days, a news van from the local NBC affiliate parked directly across the street. The next thing I knew, I was doing an impromptu interview next to the giant H, wearing sunglasses and explaining with a straight face that I was simply utilizing my property rights to prepare for future, highly efficient forms of non-commercial transportation. The story went viral, at least in a hyper-local, man-fight city hall and wins with concrete kind of way. The gawkers list. Relatable anecdote. People driving by in reverse to take photos, causing minor traffic jams. A group of kids using the giant, flat H as the perfect surface for riding their brand-new Razor scooters. One elderly couple who stood at the curb for 20 minutes, silently shaking their heads, convinced I had completely lost my mind. A drone pilot who, sensing a kindred spirit, actually tried to land his high-end drone precisely on the yellow circle. I chased him away. The helipad was mine. The victory was spectacular, public, and embarrassing for the city. And I knew this kind of public embarrassment meant only one thing. The HOA and the city council were about to organize their final, desperate counterattack. The phone call arrived 3 days after the local news segment aired. It was an official email, not orange, but filled with the ominous formality of a final judgment. Subject: Urgent. Emergency session. Revocation of provisional surface permit. The city council, facing pressure from the mayor, who had been mercilessly mocked on social media, and the relentless complaining of Mrs. Henderson, had called an emergency session to find a way to legally shut down the Jenkins helipad, and more importantly, reinstate the original dead lawn fines. This was it, the final showdown, the climax of my spiteful architecture career. The town hall auditorium was packed. All the usual suspects were there: the bewildered council members, the glowering code enforcement director, and sitting front and center, wearing a particularly severe pantsuit, was Mrs. Henderson, flanked by 2 neighbors who were clearly just there for the show. I was given 3 minutes for public comment. I knew I couldn't rely on sarcasm alone. I had to use the language of bureaucracy and fear. I stood before the council, armed with my laminated permit and a calm smile. Good evening, council members. I'm Gary Jenkins. I understand you are here tonight to discuss my property's permitted surface structure. The council president, Mr. Thompson, looked exhausted. Mr. Jenkins, frankly, we are here because this situation has made a mockery of our municipal code. You have taken a legitimate ordinance regarding residential landscaping and turned it into this. We believe the provisional approval was granted based on a deliberate misrepresentation of the intent of Chapter 14, Part B, Section 22. Mr. Thompson, I countered, using the name firmly. With respect, my intent is irrelevant. The law is based on compliance, not intent. I filed the paperwork correctly, cited the safety section correctly, and have complied with all requirements for safety markings. The structure is now a piece of approved transport infrastructure. The Code Enforcement Director, a man who looked like he hadn't smiled since 1985, leaned into the microphone. Mr. Jenkins, you do not own a helicopter. You have no stated plan to acquire one. This structure is a nuisance and is clearly designed to circumvent the initial fines levied for your blighted front lawn. The initial fines are moot, sir, I shot back, pulling out my printed copy of the ordinance. The original fine was for a failure to maintain acceptable vegetative health. I rectified that failure by removing the vegetative component entirely and replacing it with a structure designated for transportation, which is explicitly exempted from the ground cover maintenance requirements. The moment the VTOL pad permit was provisionally granted, the previous fines became legally invalid, as the nature of the property changed from a lawn to a landing surface. The room murmured. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. Furthermore, I continued, pacing slightly, building the thrill. If you vote tonight to revoke this permit, you are doing more than just fining a homeowner. You are actively voting to dismantle approved safety infrastructure. What signal does that send to the Federal Aviation Administration? Are you, the city of Pleasantville, telling the FAA that you don't prioritize safety for air traffic that might need an emergency landing zone in a densely populated suburban area? It was a bluff the size of my green concrete slab, but it was delivered with total conviction. The council members looked terrified. Threatening them with the FAA was like threatening them with an angry god. A vote to revoke, I concluded, my voice rising, is a vote to expose the city to enormous legal risk from both federal transportation authorities and any hypothetical pilot who might, God forbid, need this surface in a pinch. Then, the climax hit. Just as the council president raised his gavel, a noise began to pierce the air, a deep, rhythmic thud, thud, thud that grew rapidly louder. It wasn't my imagination. The windows of the town hall started to rattle. Thud, thud, thud. A helicopter. A real, honest-to-God, low-flying helicopter. The noise became deafening. The entire audience, including the council, rushed to the windows. I stayed put, smiling faintly. Outside, a bright yellow helicopter, Tuat, looked like a small tour chopper, or perhaps a media aircraft, was circling my house. It made one slow, deliberate pass directly over the green slab, tilting slightly as the pilot visually confirmed the massive yellow H. It didn't attempt to land, but it lingered, a buzzing, airborne confirmation of the helipad's purpose. It was perfect. I hadn't hired it. I'd simply paid a local aerial tourism company $50 to fly their normal route a little lower than usual, right around 7:30 p.m. It was a visual aid of biblical proportions. The chopper finally banked away, the noise fading. The council president, whose face was pale, slowly returned to the dais. He looked at me, then at the code enforcement director, then at Mrs. Henderson, who was now clutching her seat cushion. utterly defeated. "Mr. Jenkins," the president croaked, we are not in the business of compromising public safety. We also acknowledge the procedural adherence you demonstrated regarding the marking requirements." He inhaled deeply. "The motion to revoke the provisional surface permit is tabled indefinitely." The murmuring in the room was now applause. A victory for the little guy. Then came the final confirmation of victory. The president banged the gavel. "And furthermore, given the change in property designation from residential ground cover to transport infrastructure, the original fines levied against Mr. Jenkins for failure to maintain acceptable vegetative health are hereby rescinded." The crowd erupted. Mrs. Henderson, defeated and humiliated, stood up and marched out the back door without saying a word. I had won. The day after the town hall meeting felt like a national holiday. I had defeated the system, legally and hilariously, all while sitting on a 3,000-pound slab of green concrete. Life returned to a new kind of normal. A green normal. Mrs. Henderson, the instigator of all this magnificent chaos, went into full-scale social exile. Her blinds remained shut for a week straight. When she finally emerged, she gave my yard a wide, cautious berth, as if the concrete were cursed. Which, in a way, it was. Cursed with spiteful legality. The helipad, of course, was never used for actual vertical transport, but it found a dozen other glorious, unexpected uses. The ultimate BBQ surface, perfectly flat, easy to clean, heat-resistant, and bright green. My summer cookouts became legendary. There was never a worry about a wobbly table leg again. The neighborhood skate park, briefly. The local kids realized the surface was ideal for skateboarding and rollerblading. I allowed it briefly, until I realized I was running a public park and had to install a small, handwritten sign that read, VTOL PAD. No skateboarding, $500 fine for unauthorized use. The yard sale masterpiece. I held the most successful yard sale of my life. Everything was displayed on the beautiful, flat surface. People came just to see the helipad, and then felt obligated to buy my junk. The winter miracle. I never shoveled snow again. The dark epoxy absorbed sunlight beautifully, melting the snow and ice faster than anything else on the street. Zero maintenance, maximum smugness. I even got an occasional legitimate call. Once, a dispatcher from a regional medical transport service called, confused, having seen the FAA marker for a private H in my coordinates. I politely told them, "Sorry, man, you need a reservation," and a written letter from the city council. A local history blog picked up the story 6 months later, calling my home the site of the Great Suburban Uprising. I was a local legend, all because I refused to water my grass. I still sit on my porch almost every morning, sipping my coffee. But now, I'm sitting on a lawn chair placed precisely in the center of that massive, bright yellow H, basking in the warm glow of the Vegas green epoxy. It is the perfect spot. I often think about that initial $300 fine. It was the best $300 I ever spent because it purchased me a lifetime of zero-maintenance landscaping and maximum satisfaction. I look out at the surrounding lawns, all perfectly watered, chemically dependent, and vulnerable to the slightest violation notice. My yard, however, is a fortress. It is a legally unassailable, transportation-designated, federally acknowledged slab of industrial-grade spite. And here's the kicker. The final thought I want to leave you with. The moral of the story isn't just about fighting the man. It's about beating the man using his own complicated, ridiculous rule book. If you're going to get fined by the system, at least make the system look utterly ridiculous in the process. My yard is quiet now. Perfectly flat. Perfectly green. I sometimes consider buying a windsock just for authenticity. But nah, that would require a permit. And honestly, the silence is its own reward. The ultimate zero-maintenance victory.